This is Bill Jepson, our distinguished visitor, who is from the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of California at Los Angeles. And Bill's famous for a number of things, most one of which, at least the reason he's here today, is having built accurate, minutely accurate models of huge urban cityscapes in 3D. And he and I met a long time ago in a funny way. There had been these riots in Los Angeles some time back, and trying to communicate to the world how to move forward from that, how to rebuild from the areas that were kind of riot ravaged. Bill had the idea of modeling not only the kind of the landscape as it was, but then also possible ways of rebuilding it, putting all this stuff in a van, driving it down to these urban areas, letting people tour through and vote, like, I like it to be like that or like this, where they can see it in 3D. And then get comments back like, no, we need more lights there because that's where the drug dealers hang out. You need to illuminate that to keep them out of there. So it was a great idea. It was called Rebuild LA. And I called Bill and I said, yeah, I'd seen his work. It was so great. And I said, I've got some government people coming tomorrow. Can I do a demo? And he said, yeah, sure, no problem. And so then he watched the news the next day, and there was me and President Clinton and Vice President Gore. And I'm flying through this Rebuild LA thing, talking about Bill. And so he sent me a mail and said, next time you ask me if you can do a demo, I know you're serious. And so I called him about a month ago and said, hey, we're getting serious in Google Earth about doing 3D buildings. And the next day we announced that we bought SketchUp. So that was my part two for that. So he's here to talk today about how they build buildings and how they might work with us in the future to be kind of bring some expertise in building huge urban cityscapes.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I'm loading up Virtual LA, or at least the downtown portion thereof, and it's going to take about 8 more minutes to do. So once it's up, we're going to fly through it and investigate some things. But let me tell you a little bit, just to waste the time since we have it, about how this all got started. This actually goes back, the gestation for this actually goes back to the Apollo program. And in the late 60s and early 70s, NASA was looking for some spin-off kind of applications that justified all the money that they spent on the Apollo program. And one of our faculty, or one of the faculty at UCLA at that time, Peter Kamnitzer, got a NASA spin-off grant to use the moon landing simulator, the Apollo moon landing simulator, where, I don't know if it was Neil Armstrong or who was the other guy? Aldrin, Buzz Aldrin. I don't know who was the one who flew the lunar lander down and landed it, but it was a CRT that they practiced landing on the moon. And there was 2 of them in the world at that point in time. There was one in Houston, GE made it, and one back in GE's headquarters in New York. And so Peter got a grant to do a little 200, he was limited to 240 polygons, 240 polygon city that they could drive through. So he designed the city. They flew him to Houston. He gave it to the engineers there. 4 months later, they flew him back, and the NASA engineers had created the 240 polygon city. And they drove him around for 15 minutes, made a 16 millimeter video, or not video, actual film, sent it to him, end of the project. So in 1974, when UCLA hired me, they showed me that film, and they said, this is what we want to do. Now, remember that in 1974, the technology that we were using was, I call it the green Etch-a-Sketch. It was Tektronix storage tube, where you could draw lines on a little 15-inch screen, and in order to erase anything, you had to erase everything. So it's just like an Etch-a-Sketch. So that we were a long ways from what we can do today. But we've actually managed to replicate the lunar lander simulator and gone just a bit beyond it. So having given you more history that I'm sure you want or wanted to hear, I'll tell you a little bit about what we are doing, which is that our typical application is we look at new development in a dense urban context. We work on almost all of the high-profile projects within the city of Los Angeles. We have a model that encompasses now about 25 square miles of the city, which we interactively navigate through. We try to be as accurate as we can. We like to say that we're accurate down to the level of the signs in the windows and the graffiti on the walls. Where you see trees, those are the accurate tree types. If it's a eucalyptus, we put in eucalyptus models. We make multiple presentations to communities and people within the city. We've had theaters that have been rented out by the city or actually put on loan, or we've had 750 people come in, and we look at these new projects, and they're actually evaluated using our technology. And in fact, we go through multiple iterations on new projects because people of all walks of life can understand exactly what it is that they're seeing. So we have about 25 square miles. Now, Los Angeles is rather large, as some of you probably know. The city of Los Angeles is 500 square miles. The city proper, Los Angeles County, is 4,000 square miles. So we have a bit still to go before we can populate the entire Earth with dense urban environment. But it's moving along. Not all the 25 square miles is contiguous. It's basically spread out from Santa Monica to downtown LA, from the San Fernando Valley down to LAX. So we have a fairly large area that we cover. We can't load it all up. It just swamps the graphics card, particularly with the imagery, the textures that we use. If we had better technology, maybe we could. So there's a variety of things that we've looked at over the years in terms of applications. So before like I said, we probably have about 5 more minutes before this thing is ready to go. Are there questions that I can answer? Yeah. Whenever we have a project in an area, we go and update that area. We don't try to keep it up to date in terms of the areas that have already been built. If there's a reason to update it, we do. The costs of updating an area run, anywhere from 10 to 20% of what the original cost is of building it. The reason is that the streets don't really change their position unless there's a big earthquake or something. The buildings are typically about the same. Ground level imagery changes, but paging the imagery in and out is not that difficult. And so, we're really only going to apply our efforts where there's a particular problem that needs to be solved or a reason needs to be updated. Now, the one thing I will say, the interesting part about the update is that everything we do, we timestamp. And so, as Michael indicated, we've been doing this since around 92. Well, using this version, I've been doing this since 74. But the current gestation goes back to 92 in terms of the database. So we actually are creating a history of the city of Los Angeles. The 92 doesn't have much in it, but as we move forward and things get replaced, they don't get thrown away, they get kept. So, someday when I'm old, not that I'm not old, but that I'm older, we'll have created a history of Los Angeles, and it all gets kept. We actually, at one point, developed a time slider so that we could push the time scale back. The problem is that since we're already over using texture memory, if we load the old stuff, then that forces out new stuff, and that's not a good trade-off for us. So we typically don't load the history. And having said that, there is one other area that we work in, which is what we call historic reconstruction. So we've done Herod's second temple in Jerusalem, the Forum of Trajan in ancient Rome, and we're currently working on the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1890. So we do some other, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. So everything that we do is fully interactive. Even though the database is quite large, we try to keep the frame rate up to something that allows you to interactively navigate. We're running this on a little shuttle computer, which is not mine, so it's not as good as what we would normally be able to experience, but I can take it on the plane much more easily than the Dell computers that we use. And so you can see the little crosshair. I'm controlling where we go and what we look at with the crosshair. At any time, we can stop, look around. We're looking at a version that we put together to show the Homeland Security people. So as you see these lollipop pops going around, those are actually representing different metro rail type vehicles, police cars, fire engines, etc. We've had a grant where we've actually tracked in real time various vehicles driving around Los Angeles. So everything we do is based on, I'm going to say global coordinates. You can think of it as GPS. They're actually state plane coordinates with a local offset. But we've taken the system, put it in a car, married it to the in-car navigation system that Toyota uses, output the GPS component coordinates, and had on the dashboard an LCD panel showing the same view on the LCD panel from the virtual model that you saw at the windshield as you're driving around. Typically, the kind of thing that we get involved with is looking at new development. So here's a project that we did a few months ago, well, over the last couple of years, actually. It's a development across the street from Staples, which is where the Lakers play. This was the initial proposal. Back out to get a little bit of a view of it. So Staples was actually, and there's a little bit of Z fighting happening here. The NVIDIA cards don't have quite the same resolution on the Z buffer that the old SGIs that we used to run on have. So you get a little bit of Z fighting if you see the flashing. So this project was proposed. City Council in Los Angeles had a problem with it. They had a problem with the original Staples proposal as well. They were sent to the Anschutz Entertainment Group. Oops, I need to do one thing here. Needs to be 5.7. Okay. So anyway, AG came to us. We put in their conceptual model. They use this to get all their entitlements. This was shown to City Council. It's shown to interested community groups. That process actually went quite well, far better actually than what their Staples proposal did. So based on this, which was conceptual in nature, they went back, they hired a bunch of architects, and so there's 5 different buildings and they have 5 different architectural firms that they hired. They all delivered their plans, their final plans to us. And this is what's being built. So they came back to us, we put this in, they used this, we made them a bunch of DVDs and images or videos, and they used this at their groundbreaking, handed it out, it was on the news that night. So it's the kind of thing we do, the new development, looking at it in an urban context, people who don't necessarily even speak English, which is important in Los Angeles, can look at this and understand it. We can drive around, inspect it from every angle, and even more importantly, we evaluate it from a pedestrian or a car eye height. So it's the way people are used to looking at this kind of thing, and they understand it. So that's very valuable. However, in doing all these projects, what's happened is we've developed this very large database. Like I said, 25 square miles, probably 8 to 10 square miles just in the downtown and region. It's very accurate. It's built using a whole variety of, oops, we fell through the ground. We built it using a variety of data sources, and I'd say we probably use 30 different data, maybe more, data sources from the city on a regular basis. And in fact, we've had to go through all kinds of Homeland Security, background checks, etc., in order to get the okay to get some of this information. We're kind of a low-budget operation. This is the team vehicle here. That's Dave. Dave is one of the modelers. We work on most of the high-profile projects within the city of Los Angeles. For example, we're just starting on Exposition Park, which is where the Coliseum is. We use that for the LA's NFL bid. There's also a very large Frank Gehry development, Grand Avenue Esplanade, that we just got the call on that we'll start working. So, effectively, we tend to be involved in many of the high-profile, particularly the contentious projects in and around the city of Los Angeles. So not only do we have much of the city as it exists, but we have much of the new, at least proposed construction as it will exist. So we're typically ahead of the curve. And when that happens, of course, that's when we go back and we update those areas. So fly over here. Now, our metric or our threshold is that we need to develop these models to the point where people who live in this community can look at this and say, yeah, that's where I live. That's what it looks like. So, if we cut corners, if we don't have accurate data, then we lose our credibility, because the people who are looking at this and using it to judge some very contentious projects are going to effectively go, no, this is not, this is not what it looks like, and therefore it will call into question what it is that we're saying is going to be there. Do one other thing here. Disney Concert Hall. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask. I'm used to fielding questions as we go through this. Yes?
So how do you do your data capture?
Well,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah. The question is, how do we do the data capture? Basically, we use only one real tool, which is, well, two tools. One is digital cameras, and the other is Photoshop. Now we go ahead and we lay out the environment that we're going to be working in accurately using whatever data we can get. So for example, we'll get from LADOT drawings of what the streetscape is like, how wide the streets are, where they are, etc. It turns out, though, that the most accurate, for example, the most accurate Z data comes from the sewage department. So we'll go to the sewage department, we'll pull plans. There's one thing about the sewage department. They know how high things are because sewers work fine if they go downhill, but if they go uphill, they're really not too good. So we'll get freeway data from Caltrans. we'll get various other pieces of information, and we'll compile it into what I'm going to call the street layouts. We'll get plans for the buildings from CRA, Community Redevelopment Agency, or from other agencies, the Planning Department, etc. And we'll compile all this information in order to turn it into effectively a layout. But at the end of the day, we're going to go down there and digitally photograph everything and then use that information to build the models. So we're going to have to perspective correct all the imagery that we take. There's a lot of occlusion that happens at the street level, and so consequently you're going to have to spend a lot of time figuring out what it is that needs to be in the model. You're always operating on a budget, a polygon budget, and a texture budget, and so you don't want to apply high resolution imagery to the top of a building if you don't need it, but you may want to spend a lot of time getting the signs in the windows or the graffiti on the walls down at the lower level. So in some ways, building this is as much an exercise in art as it is one in science. We have methodologies that we've developed. We have rules of thumb that we've developed. We go through this and we effectively, as time goes on, redo the rules because the hardware gets more capable. Our ability to show imagery gets better. So, some parts of this model actually were done in '92 and have not been redone since then. But at the end of the day, we use lots of different data sources. However, the tools we use are basically Photoshop and Multigen. Multigen's a modeler we use, and Photoshop is what we use to clean up the imagery. And that's just about it. We think we can automate what we call the low level of detail. I'm going to say that there's about a stack of 25 layers of detail in this model, from the satellite view down to the ground level view. And because of the street level occlusion, and because most of what we do is going to be looked at from the street level, we're going to have boots on the ground, going through, looking at this, or in terms of the interiors that we do. You're going to have to do a lot of it by hand, by actually getting the plans and elevations for buildings and making sure things are accurate. But maybe the top 8 levels of detail, or the lowest levels of detail, could probably be automated, or maybe 10, or depending on how good the tools are, maybe even 15. So the issue isn't one of whether or not I think that we could use remote sensing type applications. I know we can. The issue is how good is that data, and how far down that stack of 25 levels can that data get us before we have to go in and start looking at individual trees. Oh yeah, that's a eucalyptus or an oak tree or southern oak, or maybe it's something else, a ficus. And so there's a whole set of issues that revolve around where you draw the line. And in particular, like I said, there's always going to be street level occlusion that you're going to have to deal with. Now, we're looking at using this model as sort of a 3D metaphor or a 3D index into a world of other information, so that people could effectively go up and say, okay, here's, well, I can't exactly read it, this is an older one, the Swatch Factory. And click on that particular, we have a point and click interface, so we can embed URLs in any polygon or any graphic image. So we could do a point and click on the Swatch Factory and pull up the Swatch Factory, interactively pull it up, the Swatch Factory's website, if we had embedded that URL. We're talking to a whole variety of different first responders and others about having building owners putting their floor plans and elevations online that the fire department or the police department could access through this kind of point and click interface. So to the extent that we can use the automated tools to, build out the first in layers of this, that would be great. That would be a big win for us.
Well, at some point, you're deciding whether to use some kind of pre-stored image versus capture in the video, right? Like in Swatch
Can you
Factory.
repeat the question?
The Swatch Factory is probably an actual image taken off the screen, right?
Right. The question is that, when do we determine when to use the actual imagery versus remote sensing type imagery?
Yeah, or just patterns like those trees.
Okay. Well, the patterns like the trees, trees are typical that the streets, for example, textures, those are all coming from a standard library. So things that, it doesn't have to be that exact tree. It just has to be a eucalyptus of about that size and that age. We're going to use pre-existing imagery, or we may have to create some, but we'll then put it into our library and use it. However, that's pretty much as far as it goes. So, for example, if we're looking at the interior of the Bradbury building here, these are the actual brick patterns in the Bradbury. So we're not going to, just because somebody's using red brick, we're not going to take a standard red brick pattern and use that. We're going to actually take the imagery from that building and use it, because if you don't, then first off, it's not going to be accurate enough. And secondly, everything's going to look the same. It's not going to have the image quality that we're looking for. So, again, as I was saying before, there's an artistic piece of this, or an aesthetic piece of this, which says, when do you use standard stock imagery? Well, it's okay for plants. Because very few people are going to inspect the plant really closely and say that's not the exact right tree. It is the right species, it is the right size, but that's not the tree that's there. But on the other hand, for a lot of this, we're going to take the imagery and develop the building from that. So we're going to actually use the imagery to build the building, so we might as well use the imagery to texture map the building. It's all one process. Other questions? Yes.
So wondering what the size of the database is, both in terms of geometry and texture?
The database, I'm going to say, is probably on the order of 85 to 90% texture versus geometry in terms of the size. We have a binary database format that was loosely defined on something that actually Michael developed after I bitched at him for a long time, called Performer Binary. So we developed our own that's based on Performer Binary. Using the binary interface size, this is about 800 megabytes, what we're looking at. We're not even looking at, we haven't gotten close to actually looking at all of this. The raw files for this are probably on the order of a couple of terabytes for the downtown model. So, we're very efficient in terms of the binary, and the raw databases are much larger. Other questions? Yes. They've contacted me a couple of times, and I think they'd rather develop their own intellectual property. And our database is very large, and they basically go through these exercises that are different from what we do. They don't have to be accurate. That's not really important. Playability is important to them, and so consequently, we haven't actually made that connection. We've talked to them. I've given them samples of our database, but things haven't progressed beyond that. Yes.
Do you have any kind of automated methods for dealing with flipping data? Like you mentioned, you have different data sources for, let's say, things like width of streets or height of buildings. So do you have any kind of automated requesting system? Like, well, the road should be this wide, and it connects to this other road that's only wide.
Yeah, the question is whether we have automated systems for determining when we have more than one data source that are in conflict, which one to use. I would call our approach to that sort of seat of the pants, in the sense that we typically know of all of our data sources which are the most accurate, but we'll also go out and verify that with digital imagery. So we would kind of take and use what we think is the most most likely to be accurate information and use that. This is visual simulation, and if the height of a skyscraper is off by a few feet, no one's ever going to notice the difference. Now, we measure the setbacks of buildings from the street, for example. So there are certain pieces of this that we know are accurate because we field verified those. And so we do take some steps to try to verify the accuracy of the information. But typically we have multiple sources, and so we can do cross checks across those sources. Yes.
Have you considered using shaders to increase image quality as opposed to brute force texture?
Yeah, we have. The problem is that in a real-time application, you have 30 milliseconds to render a frame. The more complex the computational load, the less the size of the database is going to be. So, we've looked at that. For example, on the Disney Concert Hall, we didn't really get a good metal sheen, and so we should have probably done something there. But we didn't because the scope of the project actually was fairly limited in terms of that. What we're looking at here is we're in the escape tunnels of the LA subway. How many of you knew there was a subway in Los Angeles? Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Most people in Los Angeles don't know there's actually a subway. And certainly very few have ever ridden it. We did this for the police department. They were concerned about familiarizing their officers with the ancillary areas that are not the public areas, and consequently developed a below-ground model of the subway so that they could fly around and literally stick their head underground and understand how these ancillary non-public areas are actually configured relative to the public areas. And they were concerned with a whole variety of things if there was a terrorist event, but also they were concerned with if someone, this is the jewelry district, robbed a jewelry store and ran in there with a gun and their officers weren't familiar with it. They didn't want their officers going in and chasing down, or where are the emergency exit tunnels? So there's a whole set of those kinds of questions that we can help answer. Other questions?
Are you using any lighting model?
No, we really don't. We pre-shade things, but that's about it. We often get asked whether or not we can do shadow casting, and the typical response is we can, but it's more costly. And then typically people go away when faced with the cost.
Are you using the mapping?
Oh yes, we map everything. So we'll look at a few other applications that we've layered on top of this. The interesting thing here is that once you have a fully three-dimensional, an accurate three-dimensional real-time model of a city, there are lots of different applications you can begin to layer on. Some of them are kind of fun, others are pretty, I don't know how to explain them. So one of the things we looked at, again, we plan on using this, or we want to use this as a three-dimensional metaphor or index into a whole world of data. Now, if I had this machine hooked up to the internet, which we didn't have time to do, we can fly down here, and there it is, a camera on the 10 freeway. And we can literally click on this camera and pop up a web browser and look at the video imaging streaming from that particular camera on the 10 freeway in real time. So we use this again as a way of locating things. There aren't too many cameras around. There are lots of cameras in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, we can get access to very few of them because the LA DOT is afraid of getting sued. If someone captures imagery of an auto accident, they might end up getting sued, so they won't release that kind of information, or they won't put it online. There's a whole variety of different actions that one could conceptually do, like tracking vehicles in real time, the emergency response vehicles. We also did a study for the company that makes in-car navigation systems for Toyota, hence the description I was given earlier of having an LCD panel on the dashboard that created the same view you had as you're driving around. But one of the things we're able to do, those systems know where you are via GPS. And if you punch in a destination, they'll create a either shortest travel time path or a shortest distance path, I'm not sure which, from where you are to the destination that you've asked for. Well, we're able to output those coordinates of that travel path into our system. We developed this concept of the red carpet and overlaid it on top of the model. And now as we're driving around, instead of getting these kind of strange commands from a woman's voice saying, you know, turn right 500 feet and seeing a line drawing, we're actually looking out on an LCD panel on the dashboard, this view as we drive along with a red carpet overlay. So now we're able to navigate in the same way you would if you were familiar with the route and familiar with the neighborhood by using the buildings around it as a visual cue. And we found that you could pick up the appropriate path and way to go as quickly by glancing at this as you could by seeing what's in your rearview mirror and understanding that. So it turned out that this was pretty cool. And in fact, I've been trying to get NVIDIA interested in sort of upgrading the graphics cards for in-car navigation systems in order to use the real-time 3D model aspect of this for the in-car navigation systems. Questions? Yes?
I was wondering how much time does the artist or the modelist take including grabbing the texture to like model one block of the city?
The question is, how much time does it take to model one block? My rule of thumb is 60 hours, 60 modeling hours per city block. So, you know, if you're looking at a Google Earth type application, there's a few man hours going to be there before the whole Earth is in. But we're active down at a very fine granularity, and a lot of the remote sensing kinds of things can be done to get you partway there before you need to really start spending that kind of time. So, you know, there's going to be sort of a gamut from 60 hours per city block down to, or up to, you know, being able to do fairly large piece of the city. Now, the one thing I will say, though, is that when we've laid out the city, all of our modelers know how to find everything in the model in a matter of seconds. And we're always changing this model. This is a dynamic model. As new things come online, we're taking old things out. We don't throw them away. We save them. We timestamp them. But we're always updating, changing, modifying, etc. So this model is very facile, and with remote sensing data, what you get is a cloud of points in a lot of cases that's not facile, and you can't really change it. And so, you know, there's sort of a difference in usability between a remote sensing created database and one that's been created by hand, specifically towards updating, changing, etc. Yes. The roofs of the buildings are from a set of aerials that I purchased a number of years ago that were half-meter resolution. If we could get better aerial imagery, is that the question you were asking? Is where did we get it? So we just used the aerials to map the roofs of the buildings. Yes?
You talk about the technique that you're taking kind of live, real-looking images and basically turning it someone a caricature type or kind of video, cartoonish type images, right? And you look at this. And what's the technique to actually take something that looks like a real picture and turn it into something that is apparent?
Well, the reason that if they look cartoonish, it's because we have to sample them down pretty much. I mean, yeah, and that tends to have that kind of impact. You know, we're not specifically trying to achieve that. That's actually an undesirable artifact. We want them to look real. But a lot of what we were looking at has been done in the 90s time frame, and we didn't have the texture capabilities that we have now. So, you know, we were sampling things down to literally 16 pixels by 16 pixel size in order to get as much as we can. As we move forward and frame buffers get larger, then our ability to use the imagery improves. When we were able to start compressing textures, we got a big boost there. So, but a lot of this model predates that. Sure. Gotta get this thing going again. While we fly down there, is there other questions? Yes.
Some of your users preferring more of navigation mode to another, like high height seems to be very good. Do people spend a lot of time floating and like just very high, or do they always try to go down to street level as fast as they can?
Yeah, I think they mostly use street level. Right now, this is a loaner computer, and when I put out if I put it in what we call drive mode, we tend to punch through the ground level because it's not reacting fast enough. That's a parameter, but I can't set it because of the machine that I'm operating on. But mostly people want to drive at the street level. They do not want to fly and look at the helicopter viewpoint. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that we notice. Now, they like the fact that, by and large, the mouse interface that we use is familiar to most people rather than some other kind of an interface. And so most of the people who come into my lab and fly around for about 10 minutes become very facile at using the interface. So that's been good as well. All right, so let's go down here. This is another new development that we're currently working on. It's the new headquarters for the LAPD. This is what's currently there. You notice how slowly we're sinking down to eye height. That's a problem with the way that this machine is set up. So let me go ahead and switch. Okay. So this is a new development that's been proposed. And it's what we're currently working on. So, you know, this still may look a little cartoonish. But it's getting better. Other questions?
I have a question.
Michael.
How would you characterize the skill level required of the modelers?
The question regards the skill level of the modelers. There's two pieces that go into that puzzle. One is that some people never make it, and you probably experienced that yourself in hiring people. Particularly on the aesthetic side. There's an aesthetic that needs to be applied when you do these things, and some people just don't get it. When people come in, for those who do get it, so there's a threshold, which is some people never make it, and then those who do, it usually takes them, I'm going to say, 6 months to become reasonably productive in my lab, and then another 6 months before they're pretty good. So there's a learning curve of about a year before they've really ramped up. Now the good thing is I teach classes, and so I pretty much got the methodologies down, and we have a lot of materials that say, here's how you do it, here's some rules of thumb, et cetera, et cetera. But even given that, there's some people who are just like inherently incapable of making good choices.
So is that from a set of people drawn from the Graduate School of Architecture, or are they people off the street?
Those are from people drawn from the Graduate School of Architecture. Now, let me just say this. I spent a lot of time disabusing people from the School of Architecture from things that they've been taught of how to do it. And they're basically trained to add more detail, to spend a lot of time, modeling every mullion and sill. And so you have to break them of that habit, because the imagery is actually far more realistic. I'm sorry. Than what if you use the imagery, it's going to actually look better, and it's going to be easier on the compute cycles. And so you have to break them of their bad habits. They want to lay things out logically rather than spatially, and so you have to break them of that habit. So there's a whole set of learning or unlearning that they have to go through before they can actually fit in. And so being from the School of Architecture is both a good thing aesthetically and a bad thing training-wise, because they come in with the wrong concepts and they have to be broken or retrained, shall we say. Other questions? Now this is downtown, and there's other areas we could visit. We could go to UCLA or LAX if anyone's interested, or we're almost at the end of the hour, so why don't you guys guide me what you want to do?
Other more questions?
So basically, when you add the data to the database, do you have to rebuild everything in order to make it that solid database, or you can?
Yeah, I mean, the binary has to be rebuilt. You can think of this as compiling a program. It takes me about 2.5 hours right now to recompile the downtown, which is our largest database. The recompilation process is basically loading all the raw flight files and image files and processing them into a binary. But I come in every morning and I'll reload things. And if we have an area that's going to be seeing a lot of changes over a short period of time, I'll punch a hole there and create a second binary that's just that little piece, so that we can reload that piece without reloading the whole thing. And so effectively, you can concatenate binaries, and so you don't have to spend 2.5 hours reloading a binary. Now, we also have an ability to import raw files into this, and as long as you don't do that too much, you can just go up and from the menu do an import and bring in a DXF file or a flight file or some other kind of thing. As long as it's in the right coordinates, it'll just be imported right into that particular location, and then you can fly around and look at it. But that will hose performance if you do too much of it, because we use the scene graph to communicate to the application how to render things, and that's how we keep our frame rate up. If we don't use that, then literally, I've done this experiment. If we flatten the model, we're going to get, instead of 30 frames a second, we're going to get a frame every 2 hours, which we don't find to be acceptable for our kind of application.
So basically speaking, you can work with every particular piece of your database on a separate binary. So you can actually cut the chunk, work with it, and put it back in.
Well, no, that would be effectively, the question is whether I can work with every separate piece of the database as a separate binary, and the answer would be no, that would be effectively flattening the model. And consequently, we would not be able to get good performance. So, if everything is a standalone little piece, then the higher levels of detail. You remember earlier I talked about 25 levels of detail from top to bottom? Well, there are no levels of detail if you have all these separate binaries. And consequently, you're going to just have this huge pile of raw textured polygons that this thing's going to have to render. It's not going to understand which version to render of the things that are far away, and consequently, they're going to be really heavy. Yes?
I had a question about how do you generate the levels of detail? Is that mostly for the textures or also for the geometry as well?
I would say it's even more for the geometry than for the textures, but we do it for textures as well. So we'll have maybe 3 or 4 versions of an individual building. One that's an untextured, 4 polygon or 5 polygons, 4 sides and a roof. down to a very highly articulated, multi-thousand polygon version. So the polygon count will go from 0, which is you're so far away from this building that you can't possibly see it, to thousands and thousands. The texture count will go from 1 or 2 very small textures to a couple of dozen, or maybe as many as 100, probably less than 100, but much higher resolution textures. So we're going to have both textures and polygons in the LOD range. The question becomes one of how much of the frame buffer they take up and how much of the rendering load do they take up. And depending on the building, how big it is, how important it is, those are going to range, and they're going to be quite a range in terms of the quantity there.
Levels of detail for the geometry are also being modeled.
Yeah, you tend to start. I mean, that's a natural process. You tend to start with a massing level model and then articulate that. So if you just save things out at the appropriate time, then there's almost no additional overhead. If you start with a very highly articulated model and then you try to generalize back, that's actually more difficult. And consequently, it does take more time. But if you go through the normal modeling process, the levels of detail just fall out of that almost for free. Other questions? Okay. Thank you.